In the spring of 2024, I presented an original paper at a conference in Provo, Utah. Presenting a paper at an academic conference can be exhilarating and stressful because after reading a paper aloud to a room of experts, you are often grilled with a series of questions. After I finished my paper, 15 hands shot into the air, and the first remark came from an older man near the back of the room who compared me to a well known mythicist, a comparison which I kindly rejected before taking more questions. That day had been the first time in a while that I was reminded of the mythicist paradigm, which is a fringe, though still present way of thinking about Jesus of Nazareth, which doubts his existence. Maybe you're surprised to hear that there are people, even reasonably well informed ones, who doubt the existence of Jesus. Maybe that's not surprising to you at all, and you would include yourself in the mythicist camp. And while there are arguments to be made on both sides, virtually every scholar in the field agrees that Jesus did exist, and I'd like to go through some of the best sources to demonstrate why that is the general consensus. First, I want to talk about the limitations of history and the mythicist perspective. Doing history as a scholarly discipline is about probability, not certainty. It differs from scientific experiments, which can test hypotheses over and over again to achieve results. Historians don't have this type of luxury, but must engage with the available evidence to make educated conclusions about the past. But of course, the past cannot be experienced exactly as it was, nor can we ever precisely recreate every facet of past events. In many ways, historians are storytellers who choose what things to say and what things to not say, what things to put under a spotlight and what things to keep in the shadows. Now, this is not always done with malicious intent, but it's a simple reality of human capacity and the capacity of the discipline itself. However, these limitations do not nullify the probable results that historical research can give us, research which has led nearly every scholar of the New Testament and related disciplines to agree that Jesus was a real person. But the mythicist view essentially asserts that Jesus was a myth, a fabrication of later minds about someone who didn't exist in historical reality. Mythicists tend to claim that the Gospels are theologically motivated, ahistorical accounts, and are therefore not trustworthy sources. To some mythicist scholars, the Jesus that we get in the Gospels is an amalgamation of prophets and different messianic claimants. Others have asserted that the Jesus myth, like the myths of King Arthur, sold a particular type of product to people. In other words, stories about a fictional Jesus may have been a type of propaganda pushed for societal or material gains. There's a healthy dose of work from the mythicist perspective, some of which I'll list in the description. So let's talk now about some evidence for Jesus' existence. The vast majority of reliable evidence we have for Jesus is in written material. We do not know where Jesus' tomb is, if he even had one, or the location of the house he lived in, and despite some of the claims of ardent Christians, well known religious relics are almost never shown to be legitimate. You could probably build a forest from all of the pieces of the cross that have been relics throughout history. So, most of what we have is literature, none of which was written by Jesus himself, by the way. This might sound rather meager and unhelpful, but our earliest evidence for Jesus is quite staggering considering the obscurity that he lived within. Jesus was a lower class Galilean Jew living in Roman controlled territory. It's safe to say that we don't know the names of 99% of the people from that time and place. So, by comparison, we have a great deal of material for his existence. Our first evidence comes from the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote 7 authentic letters that serve as evidence for Jesus' existence, and he's our earliest source for the historical Jesus as well. Even though Paul never met the historical Jesus, he writes frequently about Jesus' death, which assumes that Jesus really was alive at some point. Furthermore, Paul did know Jesus' brother James and his disciples Peter and John, and was opposed to the early Jesus movement in its early form, so he likely encountered other unnamed individuals who had all known Jesus as well. If Jesus never existed, it seems likely to me that Paul would have been one of the first people to figure that out. Our next source is the first century Jewish historian Josephus. After initially fighting against Rome in the First Jewish Revolt, he acted rather unsuccessfully as a mediator between the Romans and the Jewish rebels. But after the war ended, he spent the rest of his life writing extensively under the patronage of Rome. His most well-known works are the Jewish War and the Jewish Antiquities, the second of which references Jesus. Josephus and these references to Jesus deserve their own series of posts, but I'll touch on them briefly here. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct at this day. Now, it's really important to recognize that this passage from Jewish Antiquities is highly contested in the scholarly community. There are some scholars who believe that none of it is authentic to Josephus, while I think a greater majority think that there are elements of it that are authentic, but that most of it is what scholars call a Christian interpolation. That's a term that refers to a later addition made by Christian scribes who were copying this text. Josephus, as far as we know, was never a follower of Jesus. Some of the things that are said here about Jesus are pretty far-fetched, I think, particularly for a first century Jewish man who didn't believe that Jesus was actually the Christ. So the second quote from Josephus here is much shorter, but I think is equally as important to us for our purposes today. Josephus is here writing about a time when the high priest called together the Sanhedrin, and it says, "So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others." The passing nature of Josephus' reference to Jesus here seems noteworthy to me. It's not the kind of thing that a later copyist might try to slip in if they were trying to invent a mythical person. So it seems reasonable that Josephus and his audience would have known this Jesus, who some called Christ, well enough to link James to him. For our purposes here today, I think we can still add Josephus to our list of reliable sources for Jesus' existence. Now we are finally getting to the Gospels. These were written several decades after Jesus died by unknown authors in unknown places, and most critical scholars agree that the authors were not eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus either, and they certainly are all theologically motivated. While some may see these observations as enough of a reason to totally disregard the Gospels as reliable sources, I want to offer a middle way. First of all, we have many figures in history, particularly ancient history, whose life story has been embellished for one reason or another. Think Alexander the Great, Alfred the Great, Joan of Arc, George Washington. But those embellishments are layers on top of real people, not evidence of non-existence. Secondly, I do not think that the Gospels being theologically motivated precludes them from incorporating historical material. If you're familiar with me and my work, you'll know that I say this as someone devoid of personal religious devotion. But to me, the Gospels are not an either or, but a both and. They're not history or fiction, but they're history and fiction. There are certainly things within them that are better understood as literary or theological invention, but the existence of Jesus is not one of them. Now let's look at some extra-biblical Roman sources. The first is Tacitus, who is a first century Roman historian and politician. In his annals, he mentions Christians during the reign of the Emperor Nero and a Christus for whom the Christians were named, who was crucified under the orders of Pontius Pilate. This reference does come from a disinterested source, but its reliability as an independent witness to Jesus is not without its detractors. Most, however, see this reference as evidence that Tacitus believed that a real person, whom he refers to as Christus, was at the core of the Christian movement. And the last source that we'll consider today is Suetonius. Suetonius was another Roman historian, and there is a possible reference to Jesus in some of his writings. Writing on the expulsion of Jews from Rome during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, he writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, meaning Claudius, expelled them from Rome." It's unclear whether Suetonius was referring to someone named Chrestus living in Rome at the time of his writing, which could not have been Jesus, or if he was implying that the disturbances there revolved around preaching that was about someone named Christus, which the New Testament scholar James Dunn suggests may have been Jesus. The texts we've looked at today were all composed in the 1st or early 2nd century and are generally thought to be among the most reliable sources for Jesus' existence. They do have limitations and they perform some acts of fictionalization, but one thing none of them do is create Jesus out of thin air. There are plenty of interesting and important debates to have about these sources and what type of person the historical Jesus may have been, but the debate about his existence may be one that we can leave behind.